Okay, so you're interested in figuring out isolationism and globalization, right?
Two,
Big ideas about how countries interact with the world.
yeah,
We've got this stack of articles and research and notes and all that ready to go.
yeah. Ready
Uh,
to break it down.
but first, before we get into it, I'm kind of curious, like, what's your experience with these ideas? Like,
Huh.
what pops into your head when you hear those words, isolationism versus globalization?
Well, I think it's fascinating how these concepts kind of play out in our everyday lives. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We might not always realize it,
Uh,
but like our choices as consumers or travelers, even how we get our news, like all of it ties back to these huge forces shaping the world.
totally. And I think to set the stage, we should define these ideas a little bit.
Okay.
So isolationism, it basically means countries turning inward,
Yeah.
right? Focusing on self-reliance and kind of minimizing their involvement in international affairs.
Right.
On the other hand, you've got globalization, which emphasizes interconnectedness and interdependence. So nations working together through trade and investment, even cultural exchange. Yeah. But it's not as simple as like picking a side, right?
Mhm.
Our sources really dig into all the nuances, and some of the historical examples are pretty surprising.
Yeah, there really are. I mean,
Yeah.
it's fascinating how even the periods we think of as like super isolationist, they weren't totally cut off. Like
Right.
take the US in the early 19th century, for example.
Right.
The source talks about how they were focused on westward expansion and solidifying their national identity.
Mhm.
And it's almost like this period was strategic isolationism in a way.
Interesting.
By like minimizing their foreign entanglements, they could really pour all their resources into settling the West and, building up a strong foundation at home.
That makes a lot of sense. So
That
it wasn't just like shutting everyone out, but making choices that supported their goals at the time.
Right, exactly.
But then didn't things shift after World War
Oh,
One?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there was this huge disillusionment after the war and a big desire to avoid another conflict. So you see this surge in isolationist sentiment. But even then, the U.S. wasn't totally detached.
Right.
The source points to the rise of protectionist policies in the 1920s and 30s, so they were still engaged in global trade, just with a lot more barriers.
Ah,
And it's really interesting to think about how that connects to some of the economic debates that are happening today.
that's a really good point. There are definitely some echoes there.
Yeah.
It seems like there's always this tension, between wanting to protect domestic interests and the reality of an increasingly globalized world.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's dive into some of the arguments for and against this going it alone approach.
Okay.
One argument that the source brings up is that by focusing on domestic issues and steering clear of foreign entanglements, a nation could potentially achieve greater stability and prosperity.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it, but I think that argument kind of oversimplifies the complex realities of international relations.
Hmm.
The source also highlights how isolationism can actually backfire and hinder economic growth and political influence on the world stage.
Right.
By cutting themselves off, countries risk missing out on opportunities for collaboration and innovation and access to global markets.
Yeah, it's not a guaranteed path to stability.
No, not at all.
So then let's flip the coin and talk about globalization.
Okay.
The source defines it as this, increasing interconnectedness driven by trade and investment and migration, cultural exchange technology. It's everywhere.
It is. It really is.
We see it every day, right? From the clothes we wear to the food we eat to the way we communicate with each other.
Exactly. Globalization has definitely reshaped our world in profound ways.
Yeah.
Think about multinational corporations, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They operate across borders, connecting different economies, creating these vast supply chains that impact our daily lives.
Yeah.
The source even mentions international trade agreements, which can actually influence the price of the goods and services that we use all the time.
But I'm also thinking about those more critical voices, right? Like
Yeah.
the source mentions some concerns about globalization not really benefiting everyone equally.
Right.
Is it really all positive?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question. And to be honest, while globalization can definitely boost economic growth and innovation, the source highlights some very valid concerns about it widening inequality.
Right.
The benefits aren't always distributed evenly, and that can lead to job displacement in certain sectors or exploitation of workers in others. Even things like cultural homogenization are a concern.
Yeah.
It's really important to acknowledge these complexities and to think about ways to mitigate the negative consequences of globalization.
For sure. So we've got these two contrasting approaches, right?
Mm.
Isolationism with its emphasis on self-sufficiency and limited engagement. And then you've got globalization, all about interconnectedness and interdependence.
Yeah.
But it's not just a simple either situation.
Mhm.
What stands out to you about this kind of push and pull.
I think the real challenge and what our sources really dig into is finding that balance.
Yeah.
Can nations actually engage in a globalized world while still protecting their own interests? Is there a way to harness the benefits of globalization while minimizing the downsides? These are really important questions to grapple with.
Absolutely. And there aren't easy answers, right?
Mhm.
It seems like every choice comes with trade-offs, both on a national and individual level.
Hmm.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left thinking we live in a super complex and interconnected world, and isolationism and globalization represent like two ends of a spectrum.
Yeah,
And the reality is probably somewhere in between.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And as you move forward, I really encourage you to think critically about the information you encounter.
Yeah.
Where does it fall on that spectrum? What are the potential advantages and disadvantages of each approach? Those are good things to consider.
Definitely. And I think most importantly, how do these big forces actually impact you,
Yeah,
and the decisions that you make every day?
right.
That's something worth pondering.
Mm.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into isolationism versus globalization.
Absolutely.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.
Yeah, and thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bet.
Bye-bye.